If you were sitting across the table from me right now, I'd probably start with someone who looks a lot like you. Alex, 26, makes $60,000 a year at a marketing job and rents a small apartment with one roommate. Alex's Friday paycheck hits about $1,900 after taxes. For a moment, it feels like progress. Then we start listing what's already spoken for. Rent and utilities to the roommate, negative $1,250. Student loan auto pay, negative $220. Car payment and insurance, negative $510. Credit card minimums from "I'll pay it off later" buys, negative $160. By the time we finish walking through that list, more than the whole paycheck is gone. Groceries, phone bill, health insurance, going out even once? None of that is in the math yet. When I say, this is why your $60,000 can feel like $35,000, Alex just stares at the numbers. Nothing about this is laziness or bad decisions. It's simply that, in 2026, the cost of staying in place has crept up so far, it quietly eats the raise before you ever feel it. Since we're going to spend some time together, I should probably introduce myself. I'm Dax. I run Dax Invests, but right now, I'm not here as a channel. I'm just here like a friend who happens to know a bit more about money, sitting across the table from you. If we were really in the same room, I'd pull out a blank sheet and say, okay, let's slow this down. I want you to see, in plain numbers, why this feels so heavy. At the top, I'd write $60,000 salary. Under it, why does it feel like $35,000? Then I'd ask you the same simple questions I asked Alex. What's your share of rent? Any student loans, car payment, or insurance? Credit card balances that never quite go away? As we write the numbers in, you'd probably do what most people do. Lean back, go quiet for a second. Not because you're bad with money, but because, maybe for the first time, the stress in your chest has a shape on the page. So, let's go back to Alex for a second. Same age range as you, same country, same feeling of, I should be doing okay. So, why doesn't it feel okay? If you were here with me, I'd turn the paper around so it faces you and draw 3 simple boxes. Box 1. What your boss says you make. That's the $60,000. On paper, that sounds solid. It's more than a lot of people you went to school with. Box 2. What actually lands in your account? After federal tax, state tax, Social Security, maybe health insurance coming out of your paycheck, that $60,000 quietly shrinks. Now we're looking at something closer to low $40,000 in take-home pay. Box 3. What's left after staying alive? This is the box nobody talks about. Rent, loans, car, minimum payments, groceries, phone, internet. By the time we write it all down, that final box, the money that actually feels like yours, is what feels like $35,000. And sitting across from me, most people say the same quiet sentence. No one ever showed me this. Here's where the numbers start to feel unfair. On your phone, you might see headlines like, inflation is easing, or the job market is strong. Technically, those sentences are true. On average, prices are now rising slower than they did in 2022. Wages for young workers have gone up a bit too. But you and I don't live in averages. We live in rent, in car notes, in DoorDash nights, when you're too tired to cook. If you were here with me, I'd draw a tiny line for official inflation and a thicker line for your life inflation. Because maybe the government says prices are up 3% this year, but your rent renewal email came with a 10% jump. Groceries feel 15–20% higher than before the pandemic. That used car you bought? Prices on those spiked and never really went back. So even if your salary grew from, say, $50,000 to $60,000, the things you actually need didn't just follow the same smooth curve. They jumped, and your paycheck is still catching its breath. If this kind of calm, step-by-step breakdown helps you breathe a little easier about money, you might want to stick around. On this channel, we do more conversations like this. No hustle culture, no get-rich-quick tricks, just clear explanations and quiet, realistic plans for people in our situation. If you want someone to walk through the numbers with you every week, hit subscribe and turn on the little bell. So the next time the system changes, you're not facing it alone. Let's make this even more concrete. If you and I were looking at Alex's year on a whiteboard, we'd turn that $60,000 into monthly reality. Roughly, after taxes and basic payroll stuff, that's about $3,600, $3,800 hitting the bank each month. Not terrible on paper. But then we start plugging in 2026 style prices. A one-bedroom can easily run $1,500 or more in many US cities, even when average rents cool off a bit. A used car with a higher interest rate? That's $400, $500 a month, plus insurance. Groceries for one person can quietly reach $300, $500, especially if you're busy and grabbing meals out. By the time we add a phone bill, internet, gas, a couple of streaming services, and those credit card minimums that never seem to drop, the leftover number, the part that feels like your life, is thin. That's the part you're supposed to use for savings, fun, emergencies, and your future. And sitting here with you, I'd point at that thin leftover line and say, this is why your $60,000 feels like $35,000. It's not that you're doing everything wrong. It's that the floor you're standing on keeps getting more expensive. When I tell you Alex makes $60,000, some people imagine that's above average. But for 25, 34-year-olds in the US, the median is already around $59,000, $60,000 a year. Alex is not ahead. Alex is exactly normal. Now, picture the other side of the equation. By late 2023, typical rents across the US had climbed almost 30% in just 3 years. The average advertised rent is now around $2,000 a month, with $1,500, $1,800 being common for a basic one-bedroom. If you and I were looking at your numbers, I'd draw 2 arrows. One for income, rising slowly, and one for living costs, jumping in steps. Your salary line slopes gently up. Your housing line jerks higher like a staircase. That gap between the 2 lines? That's the feeling in your chest when you look at your bank app and think, why does this still feel like survival mode? And if that's you, I want you to hear this clearly. The system changed faster than you did, not the other way around. To make this more real, I'd ask you to imagine 2019 versus now. In 2019, rents were lower, used cars were cheaper, and interest on debt was less painful. Then came the pandemic, supply shocks, and the big inflation wave of 2021, 2022. Prices jumped fast. Even though inflation has cooled back down closer to 2-3% a year recently, those jumps never fully reversed. So when you hear inflation is under control again, that only means prices are rising more slowly, not that they're going back to what they were. Think of it like a ladder. The rungs got spaced farther apart, and you're still climbing from that higher rung. If we put Alex's expenses side by side, rent, car, groceries, health insurance, student loans, almost every line on that list is anchored to a post-2020 price, not a 2019 price. That's why a raise today often feels like trying to plug last year's hole. In the numbers, you might be slightly ahead. In your body, it feels like treading water. Now, let's talk about the part nobody explains well: interest rates. When inflation spiked, the Federal Reserve did the one thing it really controls. It raised the short-term interest rate that ripples through the whole system. Between 2022 and 2023, they hiked that rate 11 times, pushing borrowing costs to the highest levels in about 15 years. On a chart, that looks abstract. Sitting in front of me, it looks like your credit card APR quietly going from 16% to 24%. It looks like a car loan that used to be 3% now being 7% or 9%. It looks like mortgage rates doubling, which keeps you renting longer because owning feels completely out of reach. When I say, the system charges you rent for using money, this is what I mean. Your $60,000 isn't just fighting higher prices. It's fighting a higher price of money itself. And for someone like Alex or you, that shows up as more of each paycheck disappearing into interest, not into the thing you actually bought. Let's walk through one painful but common example together. Alex has $4,000 on a credit card at 24% APR. Minimum payment, about $100 a month. On paper, that looks manageable. In reality, if Alex only pays that minimum, most of that money is just feeding interest, not shrinking the balance. The debt barely moves. Now, layer on a car loan. Maybe $25,000 at 8% over 6 years. That's around $430 a month, plus insurance. And remember, those interest rates are partly a delayed echo of the Fed's fight with inflation. When policymakers lift rates, they're not thinking about Alex's used Honda, but Alex feels it every month. If you were across the table, we'd circle all the payments in your life that are really interest disguised as normal bills. Credit cards, car note, maybe a personal loan. The more of those circles we find, the more your $60,000 behaves like $35,000. Not because you're bad with money, but because your money is busy paying rent to the past. There's another layer, financial shocks. Imagine Alex's landlord emails. Hey, starting next lease, rent is going up $150. That's $1,800 a year. No new bedroom, no raise attached, just a higher baseline. Or Alex's car needs a $1,200 repair. No savings yet, so it goes on the card. At 24% APR, that repair slowly becomes $1,400, then $1,500 if it sits there long enough. Or a medical bill shows up for $900 after insurance. It's not catastrophic, but when you're already tight, it might as well be. A lot of Americans never hit rock bottom in a dramatic way. They just get hit with these mid-sized shocks over and over while living paycheck to paycheck. If we plotted Alex's bank balance across the year, it wouldn't be a smooth line. It would be a heart monitor. Small peaks on payday, then sharp drops when these shocks hit. That constant up-down pattern is why it's so hard to feel safe, even if the math technically works most months. To really understand why this matters, I want to zoom out from one person to entire countries. Back in 1997, parts of Asia went through a massive financial crisis. Currencies fell, stock markets crashed, and countries like Thailand, Indonesia, and South Korea had to ask the IMF for help. On the ground, it didn't look like exchange rate volatility. It looked like job losses, wage cuts, and more families falling into poverty. Imports like food and fuel became more expensive overnight because their local money suddenly bought less on the global market. Governments and the IMF tried to soften the damage with safety nets. But even with support, the shock changed people's lives for years. Why am I telling you this? Because the same basic forces, interest rates, exchange rates, inflation, liquidity, that shape Alex's credit card statement are the ones that shape entire economies. When they move the wrong way, the pain doesn't show up first in charts. It shows up first in households. Take Argentina. Over the past decade, it struggled with repeated waves of very high inflation. In 2024, prices there were rising at more than 200% a year. Even after a big policy reset, recent estimates still show inflation above 30%. Imagine your paycheck losing half its buying power in a year. Saving in local currency becomes almost pointless. People rush to spend money quickly or try to hold dollars if they can. Rent, groceries, even bus fares need constant renegotiation. Turkey has faced something similar, with inflation above 50% in 2024 and still around 30% recently, even after big interest rate hikes. For ordinary families, that means every trip to the store feels like a moving target. You and I are not living in Argentina or Turkey. The US has its own strengths and problems. But looking at these countries helps you see a pattern. When prices move way faster than incomes, it doesn't just hurt the economy. It quietly rewrites every plan regular people thought they had. Venezuela is the extreme case. For years, it went through true hyperinflation, prices rising at thousands of percent per year at certain points. At one stage, inflation was measured in the thousands. More recently, it's fallen. But even 2024's roughly 48% inflation is still brutal compared to most of the world. In real life, that meant paychecks that couldn't buy groceries by the end of the month. It meant people weighing food versus medicine. It meant millions leaving the country just to rebuild some sense of stability. Again, the point isn't to scare you or say, "This is coming to America." It's to show the outer edge of what happens when money itself stops holding its shape. In those situations, budgeting apps don't save you. The whole game board is tilted. When we look back at Alex's $60,000, we're looking at something much milder. But it exists on the same spectrum. The gap between what numbers say on paper and what life feels like when prices don't line up. Closer to home for many viewers is Greece after 2008. Greece didn't have hyperinflation. Instead, it had too much debt and not enough growth. To stay in the euro and get help from Europe and the IMF, the country accepted strict budget cuts, what you often hear called austerity. The result? Youth unemployment exploded. In the early 2010 seconds, less than 1 in 8 young people had a job. Youth employment rates dropped to around 12%, far below the European average. Degrees didn't guarantee anything. Young adults moved back in with parents or left the country entirely. Greece shows a different kind of pain. Not prices exploding, but opportunities disappearing. Instead of your paycheck shrinking in value, you can't get a paycheck at all. For a 25-year-old sitting across from me there, the question wasn't, how do I budget? It was, how do I build a life when the system doesn't really have a place for me? So, what do these stories, Asia, in 1997, Argentina, Turkey, Venezuela, Greece, actually give you besides anxiety? Patterns. First, when debts are high and interest rates or exchange rates move the wrong way, ordinary people end up paying the bill, often through inflation, unemployment, or both. Second, governments and central banks do step in. They raise or cut rates, sign deals with the IMF, create new safety nets, or impose painful budget cuts. None of that is abstract. It shows up as changes in subsidies, social programs, and taxes, the things that influence your real life. Third, people adapt. They move abroad, share apartments, shift careers, use foreign currencies, or build side incomes. None of those moves fix the system, but they change how exposed each person is to the storm. And that's where I want to bring us back to you, Alex. And that $60,000 feels like $35,000. Before we get practical, let me unpack 3 words you'll see in headlines: exchange rates, liquidity, and CDS. Exchange rate is just the price of one money in terms of another. When a country's currency falls a lot, imported stuff, fuel, tech, medicine gets more expensive. That's part of why crises in places like Asia or Argentina hit households so hard so fast. Liquidity is how easily cash moves through the system. For a person, it's, do I have money I can actually use today? For banks and markets, it's, can we turn assets into cash quickly without blowing things up? When liquidity dries up, both people and institutions start selling whatever they can, often at bad prices. CDS, or credit default swaps, are basically insurance contracts on debt. If the price of a country's CDS shoots up, it's the market saying, we're worried this borrower might not pay. You don't need to trade these things, but understanding them helps you see that the fear you feel staring at your bank app is connected to fears moving billions of dollars around the globe. Now, let's zoom back into the US and to your situation. When inflation jumped, the Fed raised rates to cool things off. That helped bring inflation down from its peak, but it also raised borrowing costs and contributed to higher mortgage and credit card rates. At the same time, rents climbed fast during the early 2020s and are still near record highs, even if growth has slowed. Wages for many workers have started to grow faster than inflation again, but that improvement sits on top of a more expensive base. So if you feel like you arrived late to the party graduating into high rent, high debt, and higher rates, you're not wrong. Older generations locked in cheaper homes, lower tuition, and lower interest rates. You're trying to build a life on hard mode, even if your salary looks decent on paper. The question isn't, is the system fair? It's, given the rules today, how do you reduce the damage to your future self? This is where personal finance meets all that macro stuff. Start with your fixed costs: rent, car payment, student loans, basic insurance. These are your personal interest rate on staying alive. The higher they are, the less flexibility you have. The lower they are, the more you can adapt when something goes wrong. Then there's your exposure to interest rates, credit cards, variable rate loans, buy now, pay later. Every balance at a high rate is the financial equivalent of standing in the rain without an umbrella. When the Fed hikes or lenders get nervous, those rates move up, not down. If we were planning together, I'd sketch 3 layers. 1. Survival. Keeping the lights on, food in the fridge, minimum payments current. 2. Stability. Building a tiny buffer so every shock doesn't go on a card. 3. Growth. Investing for future you 401k. Roth IRA. Index funds, once layers 1 and 2, are solid. Not as a strict rulebook, more like a map, so you know which layer you're working on. For a lot of people watching, survival mode is already exhausting. So let's talk about small moves that actually change the math for an Alex-type situation. The first lever is usually fixed costs. Roommates instead of living alone. A cheaper car instead of a normal payment. Saying no to that nicer apartment that would swallow an extra $300 a month. These decisions don't look glamorous on Instagram, but they change your runway. The second lever is high-interest debt. I'm not here to shame you for using credit cards to get through tight months, but every dollar you can redirect from wants into shrinking, that 24% APR balance, is a dollar working for future you, not the bank. The goal isn't to become a monk. It's to slowly turn interest from an enemy into something you're earning instead of paying. The third lever is a tiny cash buffer, even $300, $500, so the next surprise bill doesn't have to land on a card. That buffer is what turns a bad week into an inconvenience instead of a crisis. Then we can talk about ownership carefully. In the US, you've probably heard renting is throwing money away. In 2026, that's often not true. With high home prices and still elevated mortgage rates, buying too early can lock you into a huge fixed cost and leave you, house poor owner, on paper, trapped in reality. When I sit with someone like you, we don't start with the dream of a house. We start with, can you comfortably handle your current rent? Do you have any emergency savings at all? Are you still carrying high-interest debt? Only when those boxes start to look better does owning someday become a math question instead of a fantasy. Sometimes, renting with roommates and quietly stacking cash is the smartest move in a high-price, high-rate world. It doesn't feel like winning, but it can be exactly what puts you in a better position when the cycle turns. You're not failing if you don't own a home at 28. You're playing defense in a game that got more expensive. What about investing 401k, Roth IRA, index funds? Here's how I frame it in sessions. Once your basic bills are covered, you're not drowning in high-interest debt, and you've got at least a small buffer. Then, every extra dollar has 3 main jobs it could do. 1. Lower your future stress by paying down more debt. 2. Raise your future options by saving in cash. 3. Grow your future freedom by investing in broad, boring things like index funds. For many young adults, starting with even a small 401k match or $50, $100 a month into a simple fund is enough to switch your brain from "I'm always behind" to "some part of my money is quietly working for me." We're not chasing quick wins. We're building a tiny habit that scales as your income grows. The math of compound growth is slow and boring at first. Then, 10-15 years out, it's the reason some people have choices and others don't. So let's bring it all home to you, to Alex, to that feeling that $60,000 spends like $35,000. You were born into a world where rent, tuition, and asset prices grew faster than entry-level pay, where a couple of bad years of inflation left prices permanently higher, where interest rates jumped right as you were starting adult life. None of that is your fault, but you're not powerless either. You can choose a smaller apartment and a cheaper car, not because you don't deserve better, but because you're buying back breathing room. You can attack high-interest debt a little harder, not to impress anyone, but to stop paying so much rent to your past. You can start tiny, boring investments for your future self, even if it's just the cost of one dinner out. If we were sitting together, I'd point at the paper where we wrote $60,000 that feels like $35,000. And then I'd underline a different sentence. I can't fix the whole system, but I can choose how exposed I am to it. That's not a movie-style ending. It's a quiet one. But in a world like 2026, quiet, steady moves are exactly how you slowly tilt the math back in your favor.